This video from a Chicago police body camera was taken inside Smollett's home in January, at the time when he told police he was attacked. It's part of nearly 1,200 files, including more than 90 hours of footage, all newly released by the department.
All right, well, 2 a.m. You left the house at 2 a.m. It's minus 16 degrees. All right. Just afraid of being attacked. Happens to the best of us. Don't ever forget what happened to that French actor. You know what I'm talking about? Jussie Smollett.
Dave Chappelle tried to warn us about Jussie Smollett, and we should have listened. While celebrities demanded justice and politicians issued statements, Chappelle saw through what everyone else missed: the performance.
None of these details added up at all.
The story had all the right elements: the perfect villains, the perfect victim, the perfect crime for the perfect moment in American politics.
MAGA hats! MAGA hats on in Chicago.
But a comedian asking the wrong questions would expose the truth that powerful people didn't want to hear. 6 months later, the hoax that fooled a nation would unravel completely. So let's get into it.
Just afraid of being attacked. Happens to the best of us. Don't ever forget what happened to that French actor. You know what I'm talking about? Jussie Smollett.
The audience erupted in laughter as Chappelle called Smollett a very French, very famous French actor. It was vintage Chappelle, absurd, irreverent, and somehow cutting straight to the heart of something nobody else wanted to say out loud. This wasn't just comedy. This was a master comedian using humor to voice what many people were thinking but afraid to express. Chappelle walked through the narrative that had captivated America. Two white men in MAGA hats approaching a black actor in downtown Chicago at 2 a.m. during a polar vortex. Bleach and a noose conveniently on hand. The perfect storm of racial and political symbolism wrapped in a bow with "This is MAGA country."
African Americans, we were like oddly quiet.
While Hollywood celebrities flooded social media with "Justice for Jussie" posts and politicians issued outraged statements, Chappelle identified something crucial that mainstream media missed. The black community's conspicuous silence wasn't indifference or internalized homophobia. It was skepticism born from lived experience.
All right, well, 2 a.m. You left the house at 2 a.m. It's minus 16 degrees. All right. You were walking. All right.
The routine was prophetic because Chappelle understood what investigators were beginning to suspect but couldn't yet prove. This wasn't a hate crime. It was performance art designed to manipulate public opinion and generate sympathy. The comedian had become the truth teller in a story where everyone else was playing assigned roles. What made Chappelle's warning so powerful wasn't just his skepticism. It was his recognition that truth and narrative had become completely divorced in American discourse. The Smollett story was too perfect, too symbolic, too useful for existing political frameworks to be questioned by those who benefited from believing it. But the truth was already emerging in Chicago police stations and surveillance footage, and it would prove that sometimes the most important warnings come wrapped in laughter. January 29th, 2019. The temperature in Chicago had dropped to minus 16 degrees. At 2 a.m., while most of the city slept through the polar vortex, Jussie Smollett had stepped out of his apartment building into the frozen streets. What happened next would trigger a national crisis that exposed the fault lines of American politics, media, and justice. Smollett's story was precise. Two men had approached him near the intersection of East Lower North Water Street and East North Water Street. They recognized him from Empire, racial slurs, homophobic epithets, a chemical substance poured over his face and neck, fists connecting with flesh. Then the noose, a rope fashioned into a symbol of America's most violent racial history, tightened around his throat. The detail that ignited a political firestorm came next. This is MAGA country.
This video from a Chicago police body camera was taken inside Smollett's home in January at the time when he told police he was attacked. It's part of nearly 1,200 files, including more than 90 hours of footage, all newly released by the department.
By dawn, Smollett sat across from Chicago police detectives, the rope still around his neck. He explained he had removed it initially, then replaced it on his manager's advice to preserve evidence. The optics were devastating. A successful black actor, openly gay, bearing the physical signature of a lynching in America's third largest city. The story detonated across social media within hours. Politicians issued statements. Celebrities voiced outrage. The incident became a symbol of Trump-era hate crimes before any investigation had begun. But Chicago Police Department detectives were already noting discrepancies that wouldn't surface publicly for weeks. Smollett described one attacker as white. Surveillance footage from dozens of cameras in the area showed two figures in dark clothing, but their faces remained obscured. More troubling, the camera positioned to capture the alleged attack site was angled away from the intersection. The attack that supposedly lasted several minutes had occurred in a surveillance dead zone. The threatening letter had arrived 8 days earlier at the Empire production offices. A stick figure hung from a tree. "Smollett, you will die," spelled out in letters cut from magazines. White powder that tested as acetaminophen. FBI investigators were already examining the package when Smollett reported the street assault. Media coverage amplified every detail: the rope, the bleach, the MAGA reference. Each element fed into existing narratives about political violence and targeted harassment. Smollett appeared on Good Morning America, his face still bearing marks he claimed came from the attack. The interview generated millions of views and cemented his status as a hate crime survivor. But behind the scenes, detectives were tracing digital footprints that told a different story. February 13, 2019. 2 weeks after Jussie Smollett's emotional police report triggered a national conversation about hate crimes, Chicago detectives executed a search warrant that would expose the most elaborate hoax in recent memory. The Osundairo brothers weren't hiding. Abimbola and Olabinjo had returned from Nigeria on schedule, walking directly into a police investigation that had already connected them to the alleged attack. These weren't random suspects pulled from surveillance footage. They were familiar faces from the Empire set, gym partners who trained with Smollett regularly, associates who had received a $3,500 check disguised as payment for fitness and nutritional services. Inside their home, detectives discovered the physical evidence that would unravel Smollett's story completely. The rope used to create the noose, purchased from an Ace Hardware store days before the attack. Ski masks, gloves, and a red hat bought together in a coordinated shopping trip. Surveillance footage from multiple stores showing both brothers selecting these items with methodical precision. The brothers didn't require lengthy interrogation sessions or legal pressure to break. When confronted with the evidence, they confessed immediately. The attack had been choreographed. Smollett had orchestrated every detail, from the timing to the dialogue. They revealed the dress rehearsal, Smollett driving them to the exact intersection where the fake assault would occur, walking them through the choreography to ensure maximum visual impact with minimal actual injury.
I was down to do it because if we do this for him, he could probably help us out with our careers.
The confession transformed the investigation overnight. Smollett shifted from victim to primary suspect in a fraud case that had consumed national media attention for 2 weeks. Detectives who had spent hundreds of hours searching for racist attackers now focused their resources on building a case against the man who had reported the crime. February 20th brought the inevitable indictment. Felony charges for filing a false police report. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, surveillance footage, witness testimony, and physical evidence, all pointing to an elaborate deception. Police allege that Smollett had grown frustrated with the lack of attention generated by the threatening letter sent to the Empire production offices. The staged attack was designed to amplify his profile and generate the publicity that the mailed threat had failed to produce.
Now, a source told our CBS Chicago station WBBM, quote, when the letter didn't get enough attention, Smollett concocted the staged attack.
Chicago Police Superintendent Eddie T. Johnson held a press conference that demolished any remaining credibility Smollett might have retained. The attack was orchestrated by Smollett because he was dissatisfied with his salary. The actor had concocted a story that gained public sympathy and attention through calculated deception. Johnson's anger was palpable. Hundreds of detectives had worked overtime during a polar vortex to investigate what they believed was a violent hate crime. March 26 delivered a twist that stunned law enforcement and the public equally. All charges against Smollett were dropped. No trial, no conviction. A closed-door agreement that required him to forfeit his $10,000 bond and complete community service. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office provided minimal explanation for the decision that effectively erased weeks of investigation and evidence gathering. The backlash was immediate and bipartisan. Chicago's mayor expressed outrage. Police officials felt betrayed by prosecutors who had abandoned a case built on solid evidence. The decision to drop charges without trial or detailed explanation raised questions about prosecutorial discretion and equal justice that would persist for years. Chicago officials weren't finished with Smollett. If prosecutors wouldn't seek criminal accountability, the city would pursue civil remedies. April brought a lawsuit demanding $130,000, the cost of the investigation that had consumed hundreds of police hours and resources. Smollett responded with his own countersuit, claiming the city had damaged his reputation through public statements about the case. The legal warfare was far from over. A special prosecutor would soon be appointed to re-examine the case, ensuring that the hoax that had fooled millions would continue generating headlines long after the last fake punch was thrown on a frozen Chicago street. February 2020. After nearly a year of public outrage over the dropped charges, Chicago officials appointed Special Prosecutor Dan K. Webb to restore credibility to a justice system that had been publicly humiliated. The message was clear: prosecutorial discretion had its limits, and elaborate hoaxes that consumed national attention wouldn't be swept away through backroom deals. Webb's re-indictment brought 6 new felony counts of disorderly conduct. This wasn't just about punishing Smollett. It was about demonstrating that the evidence gathered during hundreds of hours of police work wouldn't be discarded without proper judicial review. The case that had died in prosecutors' offices would now face the scrutiny of a jury trial. November 2021 marked the beginning of proceedings that would finally expose the full scope of Smollett's deception under oath. The Osundero brothers took the witness stand and methodically dismantled every element of his hate crime narrative. They described the planning sessions where Smollett choreographed their performance, the script he provided for racial and homophobic slurs, the specific instructions about bleach application and rope placement, tight enough to photograph dramatically, loose enough to remove without injury. The brothers revealed the dress rehearsal conducted days before the staged attack. Smollett had driven them to the exact intersection, walking through the choreography to ensure maximum visual impact. He positioned them strategically relative to surveillance cameras, calculating angles that would capture the assault without clearly identifying the perpetrators. Even the escape route had been planned to create the appearance of random attackers fleeing into Chicago's night. Smollett's defense team attacked the brothers' credibility, arguing they were lying to avoid prosecution themselves. But the documentary evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed the $3,500 payment immediately before the attack. Surveillance footage captured their coordinated shopping trips for masks, gloves, and rope. Phone records revealed calls and text messages timed precisely around the incident. The defense's fitness training explanation collapsed under the weight of forensic accounting that showed no pattern of previous payments for such services. During closing arguments, prosecutors presented the case as calculated fraud rather than misguided publicity seeking. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a miscommunication. This was a performance. The jury was asked to consider whether someone seeking genuine fitness advice would coordinate such elaborate logistical planning, or whether the evidence pointed to deliberate deception designed to manipulate public opinion and law enforcement resources.
Jail time. I am not suicidal. I am not suicidal.
Stop laughing about Blaxcellence.
I am not suicidal, and I am innocent. I could have said that I was guilty a long time ago.
December 9, 2021 delivered the verdict that had eluded Chicago for nearly 3 years. Guilty on 5 of 6 felony counts. The jury had rejected Smollett's claims of innocence and accepted the prosecution's narrative of systematic fraud. An Emmy-nominated actor had become a convicted felon in proceedings broadcast to the same national audience that had initially sympathized with his hate crime claims. March 10, 2022 brought sentencing that shocked the courtroom. Rather than expressing remorse or accepting responsibility, Smollett stood and declared his continued innocence in terms that suggested he viewed himself as the victim of prosecutorial misconduct rather than the perpetrator of an elaborate hoax. Judge James Lynn wasn't persuaded by Smollett's protests. The sentence reflected the severity of crimes that had consumed massive law enforcement resources and damaged public trust. 150 days in Cook County Jail, 30 months of probation, over $120,000 in restitution, and a $25,000 fine. The punishment addressed both the financial cost of the investigation and the broader damage to social cohesion caused by false hate crime reports. 5 days later, Smollett's legal team secured his release through an emergency appeal that argued jail time posed unreasonable risks to his safety. An appellate court's decision to grant bond pending appeal demonstrated how celebrity status continued to influence judicial proceedings even after conviction. The man who had manipulated the system through deception was now navigating it through legal technicalities that ordinary defendants rarely accessed. The temporary freedom represented another twist in a case that had already defied conventional resolution multiple times, leaving the public to wonder whether justice would ever be definitively served. November 21, 2024. Nearly 6 years after that frozen Chicago night, the Illinois Supreme Court delivered the final twist in a case that had already defied every expectation. Jussie Smollett walked free, his conviction erased not through vindication of innocence, but through the labyrinthine mechanics of constitutional law. The court's reasoning cut straight to procedural bedrock. In March 2019, Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx had made a deal. Smollett would forfeit his $10,000 bond, complete 16 hours of community service, and the charges would vanish. The agreement was executed, the terms fulfilled, the case closed. When Special Prosecutor Dan Webb later re-indicted Smollett on substantially the same charges, the defense cried double jeopardy. The Supreme Court agreed. You cannot prosecute a man twice for the same offense, regardless of public outrage or political pressure. Webb had no standing to resurrect charges that had already been resolved through prosecutorial agreement. The conviction that had defined the case was wiped from legal existence. Webb's response carried the weight of institutional frustration. His statement made the distinction brutally clear. The court had found no error with the overwhelming evidence that Smollett orchestrated an elaborate fraud. The jury's unanimous guilty verdict remained factually sound. Smollett hadn't even challenged the evidence in his appeal. The rope purchases, the dress rehearsals, the coordinated deception with the Osundairo brothers. This was purely constitutional procedure overriding criminal accountability. The decision exposed the consequences of Fox's original prosecutorial choice. 16 hours of community service for what investigators had characterized as systematic fraud, consuming hundreds of police hours and over $130,000 in resources. That inadequate resolution had now become legally impenetrable. Webb's office issued a defiant statement disagreeing with reasoning that upends long-standing Illinois precedent. But constitutional interpretation had rendered their objections academic. Chicago bore the institutional cost. Detectives had worked overtime during a polar vortex, pulling surveillance footage from dozens of cameras. Financial investigators had traced suspicious payments and shopping receipts. Officers had interviewed witnesses who revealed the choreographed nature of the attack. The Osundairo brothers had testified under oath about the planning sessions and dress rehearsals. All of that evidence remained unchallenged and unchanged, but legal technicality had made it irrelevant. The ruling created uncomfortable precedent about prosecutorial agreements and special prosecutor authority. Legal scholars debated whether the decision protected defendants from prosecutorial overreach or created dangerous loopholes for escaping accountability through procedural maneuvering. For Chicago officials who had invested massive resources investigating what they believed was a violent hate crime, the answer felt academic. Smollett's response was notably restrained. No victory declarations, no detailed rebuttals to evidence that had convinced a jury of his guilt. The Supreme Court had granted him legal vindication while carefully avoiding any commentary on his factual innocence. He had won through constitutional interpretation rather than evidentiary dispute. The case that had consumed national attention through multiple prosecutions, dropped charges, special prosecutors, trials, convictions, and appeals had reached its final resolution. Not through definitive judgment of guilt or innocence, but through the intersection of prosecutorial discretion and double jeopardy protection. The hoax that began during a polar vortex on East Lower North Water Street in January 2019 ended not with accountability or exoneration, but with constitutional technicality that left the evidence intact and the conviction erased. Smollett himself said nothing publicly about the ruling, no press conferences, no social media victories. His lawyers issued brief statements acknowledging the decision while carefully avoiding any claims of actual innocence. They understood what Webb understood. This was procedural warfare, not factual vindication. The case that had started with two figures in dark clothing approaching an actor during a polar vortex had ended not in a courtroom, but in constitutional interpretation. 6 years of investigations, trials, convictions, and appeals collapsed into a single procedural ruling that left all the evidence intact but legally irrelevant. Chicago was left holding the bill for an investigation that had produced overwhelming evidence of guilt, a unanimous jury conviction, and ultimately nothing. The system had protected Jussie Smollett not because he was innocent, but because prosecutors had negotiated away their ability to hold him accountable. The hoax had succeeded in ways its architect never could have planned. But even with his conviction overturned, Jussie Smollett didn't exactly walk back into the industry with open arms. By the time the court reversed the ruling, the damage had already been done. His role on Empire was gone. He had been written out of the final episodes during the show's 6th and final season. The producers didn't make a public show of it, just quietly cut him off. And since then, no major film or TV roles have followed. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.